The crystal chandelier above the grand ballroom scattered light like frozen rain across the marble floors. Sienna Walsh balanced a silver tray of champagne flutes with practiced ease, weaving through clusters of guests draped in designer gowns and tailored suits. The annual Ashford Foundation Gala drew the wealthiest names in California. And tonight the mansion buzzed with the energy of people who believed their money could change the world. Sienna kept her eyes lowered. The way she had learned during her first week working for the catering company, invisible was safest. Invisible meant no awkward questions about why a college dropout was serving drinks instead of finishing her degree. It meant nobody asked about the medical bills that kept piling up, or the father waiting at home whose dialysis and treatments consumed every dollar she earned. She moved toward the service corridor, her black uniform blending into the shadows near the kitchen entrance. The tray was almost empty when a slight tremor rippled through the floor. Sienna paused, glancing down at the champagne flutes. Tiny ripples disturbed the golden liquid. Before she could process what it meant, a sharper jolt knocked her sideways. Glasses shattered against the marble. The sound cut through the string quartet's melody like breaking bones. Guests gasped and stumbled. The chandelier swayed overhead, its crystals chiming an ominous warning. Sienna's heart hammered as she dropped to her knees, instinctively covering her head. Everyone remained calm. The voice carried authority without shouting. Dominic Ashford stood near the grand staircase, one hand gripping the banister, his dark suit immaculate despite the chaos. His sharp features held no panic, only the cool calculation of someone used to controlling every variable in his environment. Please move away from the windows and chandeliers. Staff, guide guests to the main corridor. Another tremor rolled through the foundation, stronger this time. Screams erupted as the chandelier's chain groaned. Dominic moved with sudden speed, pulling an elderly woman away from the center of the room. Just as several crystals broke free and crashed to the floor where she had been standing, Sienna scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking as she picked up larger shards of broken glass. A supervisor rushed past, barking orders. All service staff to the lower exits. Move quickly, but don't run. Help anyone who needs assistance. The lower exits meant the basement corridors. Sienna's stomach dropped, but she nodded and turned toward the service stairs. As she reached the doorway, someone grabbed her elbow. She spun to find Dominic Ashford looking directly at her, his gray eyes intense beneath dark brows. "You know the basement layout?" he asked. Sienna blinked, surprised he was speaking to her at all. "Yes, sir. I helped with inventory storage last month. Good, come with me. I need to check the main gas lines before anyone goes down there." She wanted to protest that she was just catering staff, that surely he had security or maintenance people for this, but another tremor decided for her. This one felt different, deep grinding sensation that suggested something fundamental was shifting beneath them. They descended the service, stairs together. Dominic leading with a flashlight he had pulled from an emergency kit near the door. The basement stretched out in a maze of storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and century-old wine cellars that had been converted for modern use. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying the musty scent of old stone and earth. "The main shut-off valve is past the wine storage," Dominic said, his voice echoing off concrete walls. "If the earthquake ruptured a gas line, we need to cut it before anyone else comes down here." Sienna followed close behind, her phone flashlight adding a second beam to the darkness. Emergency lighting cast weak pools of yellow along the corridor, but entire sections remained pitch black. They passed rows of shelving stacked with event supplies, old furniture covered in sheets, and filing cabinets that probably held decades of business records. The wine cellar occupied the oldest part of the basement, its walls made of stone blocks that predated the modern mansion above. Heavy wooden racks held hundreds of bottles, their labels facing outward in neat rows. The temperature here was carefully controlled, kept cool and dry to preserve vintages worth more than Sienna earned in a year. Dominic moved to a panel on the far wall, checking gauges and valves. Sienna hung back near the entrance, her beams sweeping across the bottles. Some of the labels were in French, others Italian, the dates going back decades. She wondered what it felt like to live in a world where you could store bottles of wine that cost more than emergency room visits. A deep rumble rolled through the earth. This time, it did not stop. The floor bucked beneath them like a living thing. Sienna cried out and grabbed the nearest wine rack as bottles began sliding from their slots. Glass exploded across the stone floor, red wine spreading like blood in the dim light. Dominic lunged toward her, pulling her away from the collapsing rack. They stumbled backward together as the entire wall of wine began to fall in a cascading chain reaction. The noise was deafening, glass shattering, wood splintering. The grinding roar of stone shifting under impossible pressure. The doorway they had entered through suddenly filled with dust and debris. Stone blocks from the ceiling crashed down, sealing the entrance completely. Emergency lights flickered and died. Darkness swallowed everything except their two flashlight beams, which now seemed impossibly fragile against the weight of earth and stone surrounding them. Sienna's breath came in short gasps. She pressed her back against the wall, feeling the cold seep through her uniform. The air tasted of dust and spilled wine. Somewhere in the darkness, water was dripping with steady persistence. Dominic's flashlight beam swept across the blocked entrance. Massive stones had fallen in a way that suggested they would not be moving them without heavy equipment. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "We're sealed in," he said quietly. Then his light found a thin stream of water trickling through a crack in the wall near the floor. His expression changed, something dark flickering across his features, before he locked it away behind rigid control. "And the foundation is compromised. Water is coming through the bedrock." Sienna watched the trickle become a stream, then spread across the floor toward their feet. The cold water touched her shoes and she shivered, not entirely from the temperature. They were trapped in a basement that was starting to flood. With no way to call for help and no guarantee that anyone knew where they were, she looked at Dominic Ashford, the billionaire who had everything, and saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not just concern or frustration, but the sharp edge of genuine fear. And somehow that made everything feel even more terrifyingly real. Asterisk. The water crept across the stone floor with patient determination, spreading from the crack in the wall like dark fingers reaching toward them. Sienna watched it pool around wine bottles that had survived the collapse, their labels already beginning to peel and float away. The temperature in the cellar dropped noticeably, each breath now visible as a faint mist in the beam of their flashlights. Dominic moved along the blocked entrance, testing stones with his hands, pushing against them with his shoulder. Each attempt produced nothing but the scrape of immovable weight and small cascades of dust. Sienna could see the tension building in his movements. The way his breathing had become more controlled, more deliberate, as if he was forcing each inhale and exhale to follow a specific rhythm. "There has to be another way out," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "These old mansions always had multiple access points. Service tunnels, delivery entrances, something." Dominic stopped pushing against the stones. He turned to face her, and in the crossing beams of their flashlights, she saw sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "You're right. The original mansion had cold delivery tunnels. They were sealed decades ago, but the access point should be behind the far wall." They waded through ankle-deep water toward the back of the cellar. Sienna's shoes squelched with each step, her pants soaked to the knees. The cold bit through the fabric, making her muscles ache. She hugged herself, trying to preserve warmth, but the damp air seemed to pull heat from her body with greedy efficiency. The back wall was older than the rest, its stones darker and more irregular. Dominic ran his hands along the surface, searching for any sign of a sealed entrance. His fingers traced the mortar lines, pressing, testing. Sienna joined him, her smaller hands exploring lower sections he couldn't easily reach. "Here," she said suddenly. Her fingers had found a section where the mortar crumbled easily under pressure. "This feels different. Newer maybe, or just weaker." Dominic crouched beside her, examining the area. "It's been patched, probably when they sealed the tunnel." He pulled out his phone, checked the screen, and cursed softly. "No signal down here. We're on our own." The water was now shin-deep and rising faster. Something about the increasing depth seemed to affect Dominic more than it should. His breathing had become irregular again, and Sienna noticed his hands shaking as he examined the wall. Not from cold, not from exertion, but from something deeper. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "Fine." The word came out too fast, too sharp. He stood abruptly, putting distance between them, and began searching for something to use as a tool. He found a metal bracket that had held one of the wine racks and started chipping away at the weakened mortar. Sienna watched him work, saw the barely contained panic in every movement. She had seen that kind of fear before in her father's eyes during his worst moments in the hospital. The kind of fear that came from old wounds reopening. "I almost drowned once," she said softly. "I was 8. Fell through ice on a pond near our house." Dominic's hands stilled on the metal bracket. He didn't turn around, but she knew he was listening. "My mom pulled me out," Sienna continued. "But for those few minutes underwater, everything was dark and cold, and I couldn't tell which way was up. Sometimes I still dream about it. The feeling of being trapped under something too heavy to break through." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the drip of water and the distant groan of settling stone. When Dominic finally spoke, his voice was rough, stripped of its earlier authority. "I was 12. House fire. My younger brother and I were in the basement playroom." He resumed chipping at the mortar, but slower now, each strike more measured. The stairs collapsed. Smoke filled everything. I found a window, broke through, crawled out, but Jackson was on the other side of the room. I tried to go back, but the floor gave way between us. Sienna's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." They pulled him out 20 minutes later. 20 minutes. He survived another 2 days in the hospital before the smoke damage was too much. Dominic's hands had stopped shaking now that the words were coming out. "I built this empire, bought this mansion, threw these galas, all of it trying to prove I wasn't that helpless kid anymore. But put me in a basement with rising water, and suddenly I'm 12 again, watching everything collapse and knowing I can't save anyone?" The confession hung in the cold air between them. Sienna moved closer, standing beside him at the wall. She didn't touch him, didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, she picked up a broken piece of wood from a shattered wine rack and started working on a different section of the weak mortar. "My father needs dialysis 3 times a week," she said as she worked. "Kidney failure from diabetes he couldn't afford to manage properly. I dropped out of college to pay for his treatment. Every scholarship, every plan I had, gone because the insurance wouldn't cover enough, and medical debt doesn't care about your dreams." She chipped away another chunk of mortar, exposing older stone beneath. "I serve champagne to people who spend more on a single bottle of wine than my father's monthly medication costs. And I smile and stay invisible because that's what survival looks like for people like me. But you want to know the truth? I'm terrified every single day that I won't be fast enough, earn enough, do enough to keep him alive." Dominic looked at her then. Really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since they had been trapped together. "That's why you were working tonight, instead of evacuating with the other staff. You couldn't afford to lose the hours." "Every shift counts," she said simply. They worked in silence for several minutes, chipping away at the old mortar. The water had reached their knees now, and Sienna's whole body shook with cold. Her fingers were numb, making it hard to grip the wooden tool. She slipped once, catching herself against the wall, and felt Dominic's hand steady her elbow. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For being human? For not pretending you have all the answers?" She met his eyes in the flashlight beam. "For not being the untouchable billionaire everyone thinks you are?" Something shifted in Dominic's expression. A wall crumbling that had nothing to do with the physical barrier they were attacking. "I stopped being real a long time ago. Easier to be the image than deal with the reality." "Well, reality is here whether we want it or not," Sienna said, gesturing at the water rising around them. "Might as well face it together." A large section of mortar suddenly gave way, revealing darkness beyond. Cold air rushed through the gap, carrying the scent of earth and minerals. Dominic widened the hole, pulling away stones until they could see through to what lay behind. A tunnel stretched into blackness. Its walls rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture. Water trickled along its floor, suggesting it connected to the same underground spring feeding into the cellar. But it also meant possible escape, a way out that didn't depend on rescue teams finding them in time. "It's narrow," Dominic said, shining his light into the passage. "And we don't know where it leads or if it's stable." "We know where staying here leads," Sienna replied. The water was waist-deep now, the cold stealing feeling from her legs. "And I didn't survive falling through ice just to drown in a wine cellar." Dominic almost smiled, a brief flicker that softened his features. "You first or me?" "You," Sienna decided. "If it collapses, at least you can pull me back. If I go first and it caves in, you're stuck here alone," he nodded, understanding the logic, even if neither wanted to voice the darker implications. Dominic enlarged the hole enough to fit through, then squeezed into the tunnel. Sienna followed immediately after, not wanting to be separated from the only other person in this nightmare. The tunnel was tight, forcing them to move in a crouch. Water flowed past their feet, deeper here than in the cellar. Their flashlights revealed walls carved decades ago by workers long dead, support timbers black with age and moisture. Some sections had partially collapsed, requiring them to squeeze through gaps. Barely wide enough for their bodies, Sienna's lungs burned from the exertion in the damp air. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, every movement a fight against exhaustion and cold. Ahead of her, Dominic kept moving with grim determination. Occasionally looking back to make sure she was still following, they had been crawling for what felt like hours. It was probably only minutes when Dominic stopped suddenly. Sienna nearly crashed into him. "What is it?" she asked. His flashlight revealed a fork in the tunnel. One path continued straight, relatively clear but descending deeper. The other branched upward, partially blocked by fallen stones but possibly leading toward the surface. Asterisk. The choice presented itself in the beam of their flashlights like a question neither wanted to answer. Dominic studied both tunnels, his analytical mind clearly working through probabilities and risks. But down here in the dark, with water rising and cold eating into their bones, all the money and power in the world couldn't calculate the right path forward. "The upward tunnel makes logical sense," he said finally. "But if those fallen stones shift while we're climbing through, we're buried alive." Sienna examined the downward path. "And this one might lead to the source of the water. We could end up trapped in a flooded chamber with no way out. So we're choosing between being crushed or drowned." Dominic's laugh was hollow, bitter. "It feels appropriate somehow." Sienna was looking at something else now. She moved her light along the walls near the upward tunnel, studying markings carved into the stone. "Look at this. Someone scored the wall here. It's recent, or at least more recent than everything else down here." Dominic joined her, examining the marks. They were simple lines, but deliberate, forming an arrow pointing upward. "Survey markers, maybe. Someone mapped these tunnels, which means that path has been explored and deemed safe enough to mark," Sienna reasoned. "It's not a guarantee, but it's better than nothing."
Ow.
They stood there in the cold darkness, water now past their waists and rising steadily. Every minute they delayed meant less chance of survival. Dominic turned to Sienna, and in that moment, she saw not the billionaire, not the image carefully crafted for cameras and boardrooms, but just a man who had lost his brother to similar darkness and feared failing again. "I won't let you die down here," he said quietly. With absolute conviction, "Good," Sienna replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Because I have no intention of letting you die either. My father needs his treatment, and I need to be there to make sure he gets it, which means we both make it out." Something passed between them in that exchange, an unspoken promise that transcended their different worlds. Rich or poor, powerful or struggling, they were just two people fighting for their lives and refusing to surrender. Dominic tested the fallen, stones blocking the upward tunnel, carefully removing loose rocks and creating a path through. Sienna helped, her smaller hands reaching into gaps he couldn't access, feeling for stable holds. They worked together with increasing synchronization, each anticipating what the other needed before words were necessary. The water reached their chests by the time they had cleared enough space to attempt passage. Dominic went first again, pulling himself up into the narrow opening. His flashlight disappeared into the darkness above. Then his voice echoed back down. "It's tight but manageable. There's another chamber about 20 feet up. Come on, Sienna gripped the rocks and began climbing. Her frozen fingers struggled for purchase, her exhausted muscles screaming protest. Halfway through the passage, a stone shifted under her weight. She gasped, feeling herself start to slip backward toward the water below. Strong hands grabbed her wrists. Dominic had braced himself in the tunnel and caught her, his grip firm despite his own exhaustion. I've got you. Find your footing. She did, pressing her feet against the tunnel walls and pushing upward while Dominic pulled. They worked in tandem, breath by breath, until she collapsed beside him in the chamber above. They lay there for a moment, panting, their flashlights casting crazy shadows across the ceiling. The chamber was larger than the tunnel, carved from natural limestone by water over countless years. The ceiling rose high enough for them to stand, and the sound of flowing water came from somewhere ahead. But different from the rising flood below, this sounded like movement, like current going somewhere instead of pooling in place. They followed the sound through another passage. This one taller and showing signs of more recent human activity. Metal brackets had been installed in the walls, probably for inspection lighting. Electrical conduits ran along the ceiling, though the wires were long dead. The water here flowed in a channel carved into the floor, heading steadily in one direction. We're following the spring to its outlet, Sienna realized. This has to lead somewhere. Hope flickered, dangerous and fragile. They moved faster now, driven by the possibility of escape. The passage wound upward through the bedrock, sometimes steep enough that they had to climb using the old metal brackets as handholds. Sienna's body moved on pure will, her muscles long past the point of normal endurance. Ahead, the darkness seemed less absolute. Not light exactly, but a thinning of the blackness, a suggestion that somewhere above them the sun still existed. Dominic switched off his flashlight to confirm it. Yes, definitely lighter ahead. They emerged into another chamber, this one with a vertical shaft rising toward the surface. Pale moonlight filtered down from above, beautiful and impossible. Metal rungs had been set into the stone wall, forming a ladder stretching up 30 feet to what looked like a great emergency access, Dominic breathed. For maintenance workers. I never even knew this existed. They climbed the ladder together, every rung an agony of effort and hope combined. Sienna's hands were bleeding, torn by rocks and rough metal. Her body shook so violently she could barely hold on. But Dominic stayed below her, ready to catch her if she fell, his presence a constant reassurance that she was not alone. At the top, the metal grate was locked, but old. Dominic braced himself on the ladder and kicked upward with both feet. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th impact, the lock broke and the grate flew open. Fresh air poured down the shaft, so sweet and cold and perfect that Sienna nearly cried. They pulled themselves out into the Ashford Mansion gardens, collapsing onto wet grass that had never felt more luxurious. Above them, stars scattered across a clear night sky, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded in the darkness below. The sounds of sirens and voices drifted from the mansion, rescue teams still searching. Sienna lay on her back, breathing deeply, feeling life return to her frozen limbs. Beside her, Dominic did the same, his perfect suit now torn and filthy, his carefully maintained image completely destroyed. And somehow, that made him more real, more human than anything she had seen before. We made it, she whispered, almost afraid to believe it. We did, Dominic confirmed. Then after a pause, thank you. For what? For not letting me give up? For being stronger than I was? He turned his head to look at her. For showing me what real courage looks like? Before Sienna could respond, voices shouted nearby. Flashlight beams swept across the garden as rescue workers spotted them. People rushed over, wrapping them in blankets, checking for injuries. Asking questions neither had the energy to answer fully, as they were being led toward ambulances. Dominic caught Sienna's hand. Your father's treatment, he said quietly. I'm taking care of it, all of it. And before you argue, this isn't charity. You saved my life down there. Let me return the favor. Sienna wanted to protest, to maintain her pride, to refuse help she hadn't earned. But looking into his eyes, she saw not pity or obligation, but genuine respect. And sometimes accepting help was its own kind of courage. "Okay," she said simply. "Thank you." 3 weeks later, Sienna walked through the reconstructed entrance of the Ashford mansion. The earthquake damage had been repaired, the wine cellar sealed permanently, and the old tunnel system properly documented and secured. She wasn't wearing a catering uniform this time. Instead, she carried a folder of college applications and scholarship paperwork. Her tuition fully funded by a foundation Dominic had established for exactly this purpose. He met her in the same grand ballroom where everything had begun, though now it held desks and computers instead of champagne and crystal. "How's your father?" he asked, strong. "Getting stronger every day. The new treatment is working." She smiled, genuine and warm. "How are you?" "Better." "Seeing a therapist about the fire? About Jackson? Learning that survival means more than just staying alive." He gestured at the transformed space. "I'm converting the mansion into a community center. Art programs, tutoring, medical resources. All the things people actually need instead of another venue for expensive parties." Sienna looked around at the changes, at the dream taking shape. "The untouchable billionaire becomes human after all." "Had a good teacher," Dominic replied. And there was something in his smile that suggested this was only the beginning of their story, not the end. Outside, the California sun warmed the gardens where they had emerged from darkness into light, where two people from different worlds had learned that courage, compassion, and connection were the only currencies that truly mattered when everything else fell away.